In 1946, a masked man terrorized a small American town with a string of brutal murders. The killings stopped, but his shadow never left. Every year, that same town gathers to watch their trauma play out on the big screen. Texarkana sits right on the border of Texas and Arkansas, literally split down the middle by a state line. In 1946, it was home to roughly 40,000 people who knew each other's business, attended the same churches, and sent their kids to the same schools. The war was over. Young couples had cars and freedoms their parents never knew. Friday nights meant driving out to secluded spots along the railroad tracks or near Spring Lake Park. Privacy came easy on the dark back roads outside town. That spring, those same back roads became hunting grounds. A killer emerged who would earn a name that still echoes through local conversations today: the Phantom Killer. February 22, 1946. Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry were parked on a lover's lane when a figure approached their car. White cloth sack over his head, crude eye holes cut out. He ordered them out at gunpoint, beat Jimmy with a flashlight, and assaulted Mary Jean before they managed to escape. 4 weeks later, Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore weren't so lucky. They were found shot to death in Griffin's car on another lover's lane, their bodies placed in a way that suggested deliberate staging by their killer. The pattern was clear: always couples, always at night, always in cars parked where young people thought they were safe. Within weeks, Texarkana changed completely. According to J.Q. Mahaffey, editor of the Texarkana Gazette, local stores sold record numbers of guns that month. The Paramount Theater's manager said weekend attendance dropped sharply. Local churches organized prayer vigils that doubled as safety escorts. Neighbors took turns watching each other's houses after dark. Streets that once filled with evening conversations fell silent after sunset. Police set up roadblocks and increased patrols, but the killer seemed to anticipate their movements. On April 14th, Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker became his next victims, found dead near Spring Lake Park. Then came May 3rd. The killer struck at the Starks farmhouse, breaking his established pattern. Virgil Starks died from a gunshot through his living room window. His wife Katie was shot in the face but managed to run from the house. Bleeding heavily, she made it nearly 100 yards to a neighbor's home before collapsing. The Phantom wasn't limiting himself to lovers' lanes anymore. For about 5 months, from February through that summer, Texarkana lived under what residents later described as a siege. The actual attacks spanned just 10 weeks, but the fear lingered long after the last shot was fired. Store owners kept shotguns behind their counters. Teenagers found themselves under strict curfews that their parents enforced with unusual seriousness. The community that had always prided itself on trusting neighbors suddenly resembled a town expecting invasion. Texas Rangers arrived to join what became one of the most intense manhunts the region had ever seen. Captain Manuel "Lone Wolf" Gonzalez brought in fingerprint experts and bloodhounds. They followed hundreds of tips, interrogated dozens of suspects, and focused their attention on repeat offenders with violent histories. One name kept surfacing: Ewell Swinney, a car thief in his late 20s, in and out of prison since his teens. Swinney had been in Texarkana during the murders. He matched witness descriptions. He had access to the types of weapons used. Most importantly, his wife, Peggy, told investigators that Swinney had confessed to the murders during drunken episodes. She provided details that hadn't been released to the public. She described how he had talked about the victims, about the specific locations, about methods that only the killer would know. Rangers arrested Swinney in July 1946. They were confident they had their man. But confidence wasn't enough for conviction. Texas law in 1946 prohibited wives from testifying against their husbands without their consent. Swinney refused to give that consent. Without Peggy's testimony, prosecutors had circumstantial evidence and speculation. Not enough for a murder trial in a death penalty state. Swinney was convicted on car theft charges and sentenced to life in prison as a habitual offender. He would spend decades behind bars, but not for the crimes that terrorized Texarkana. The murders stopped. The fear gradually lifted, but questions remained. No trial, no guilty verdict, no official confirmation that the right man was behind bars. 30 years passed. Then filmmaker Charles Pierce arrived in Texarkana with a crew, equipment, and a script he said would tell the true story of the Phantom murders. The Town That Dreaded Sundown premiered in 1976. Pierce shot scenes at the actual locations where people had died. He used names closely resembling the real victims. He marketed the film as a documentary-style recreation of events. But the movie Pierce delivered mixed documented facts with fictional scenes created for dramatic effect. The Phantom became a more theatrical killer than the methodical predator who would actually terrorize the town. Reality gave way to cinema. The film earned over $5 million nationwide, making it one of the highest-grossing independent films of its time. Pierce had transformed local tragedy into profitable entertainment. Not everyone appreciated the transformation. In 1978, the family of victim Polly Ann Moore filed a lawsuit against Pierce and his production company. They argued that the film invaded their privacy, caused emotional distress, and damaged their loved one's memory by mixing her real death with fictional elements. The lawsuit raised questions no one wanted to answer. When does storytelling cross into exploitation? Who gets to profit from tragedy? How far can filmmakers go before they strip families of dignity? The case was settled quietly, but the questions never were. Today, every October, Texarkana hosts an outdoor screening of The Town That Dreaded Sundown at Spring Lake Park, the same park where Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker were found murdered in 1946. Hundreds of residents spread blankets on the grass. Families bring folding chairs and coolers full of snacks. Local businesses sponsor the event. The mayor typically offers opening remarks about community pride and local history. Children who weren't born when the movie was made watch actors portray their grandparents' generation living in fear. Teenagers learn about the Phantom not from textbooks, but from Hollywood's interpretation of what happened to their community. The event has become a tradition passed down through generations. Parents who attended as children now bring their own kids. What started as a single screening has evolved into an annual celebration of the town's most notorious chapter. Phantom-themed businesses operate year-round now. Ghost tour companies guide visitors to the crime scenes. Local bookstores sell histories that blend documented facts with decades of accumulated speculation. One local motel even advertised its proximity to the Phantom murder sites. A killer who once made this community afraid to leave their houses after dark now draws tourists from across the country. Jimmy Hollis, the survivor of the first attack, lived for decades after that February night in 1946. He died in 1992, carrying the memory of that trauma to the end of his life. The families of the victims have watched their relatives' deaths become entertainment, then tourism, then local identity. Some have embraced the attention, others have moved away from Texarkana entirely. Charles Pierce's movie gave the community something the 1946 investigation never could, a story with an ending. Even a partly fictional ending felt more satisfying than eternal uncertainty. But that satisfaction came with costs that weren't calculated in 1976. The real people who lived through the terror became characters in someone else's narrative. Their actual memories were overshadowed by Hollywood's version of events. 3 generations of Texarkana residents have grown up learning their town's history through the lens of entertainment. The line between what really happened and what makes for good cinema has essentially disappeared. UL Swinney was released from prison in 1973 after an appeal. He died in the 1990s, taking any secrets with him. By then, the physical evidence had long since deteriorated. The truth about the Phantom Killer's identity may be lost forever, but Texarkana has moved past needing that truth.
Walk through downtown Texarkana today, and the Phantom is everywhere. Local businesses reference him in their names and marketing. Ghost tours stop at the places where he struck. Conversations between locals and tourists inevitably turn to the murders and the mystery that was never solved. The October screenings now draw tourists from multiple states, sponsored locally, promoted by official tourism campaigns. Whether this represents healing depends entirely on who you ask. Families who lost people in 1946 see something different than the vendors selling Phantom t-shirts. Some families have made peace with it. Others moved away years ago, unwilling to watch their relatives' deaths turned into annual entertainment. The killer, who once made Texarkana afraid to leave houses after dark, now brings visitors into town. Memory and movie have become the same thing. The Phantom Killer vanished in 1946. His shadow never did. Every October, when the screen lights up at Spring Lake Park, families spread blankets where people once died. They eat popcorn and watch actors recreate their grandparents' worst memories. The question isn't whether the Phantom was ever caught. The real question is whether turning final moments into annual entertainment honors memory or exploits it.